That bleak economic outlook is affecting many countries. It is the focus of a G20 summit, which is currently underway in Indonesia. Finance leaders and central bank governors from 20 major economies are in Bali for 2 days of talks. Discussions will centre on the knock-on effects of the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has blamed Moscow for the economic crisis. Let's go to our correspondent Jessica Washington, who is live at the summit in Bali. Jessica, what are we expecting?
Well, throughout the course of the meetings today on Friday in Bali here in local time, we have been hearing these urgent calls for action on food security. And to provide context on that, I'd like to bring in my guest, Achim Steiner from the UNDP Administrator. Thank you so much for joining us. You've said that we're facing the worst cost of living crisis in decades, 71 million people pushed into poverty just in recent months. How bad is the situation in terms of global food insecurity that the world is facing?
Well, just to give you a sense, in just 3 months, 71 million people being impoverished, falling into poverty is even faster than COVID-19 caused in the first 3 months. So that just gives you a sense of the magnitude of how essentially 3 factors have really driven this cost of living crisis: food, fuel and finance, which is why the UN Secretary General established 2 months ago the Global Crisis Response Group in order to alert the world to the cumulative impact that this would have not only on individuals, on households and families, but what we're now seeing is indeed on the global economy, and particularly on developing countries where fiscal space is essentially exhausted, levels of debt are rising, and now the cost of servicing that debt is also increasing on top of the food and fuel prices. So we are faced with a very serious prospect.
You've been present at these meetings, you've been speaking at these closed-door meetings. Do you think that the international community is doing enough, particularly to meet the challenges that developing countries are facing at this moment?
Clearly not, because when you have 71 million people falling into poverty, when you have probably more than 300 million people faced with essentially acute hunger situation this year, when you see probably about 80 countries being debt vulnerable, and we are meeting at the Bretton Woods meetings in Washington, the G20, which accounts for 80% of the world's economy, is currently struggling to set up an agile response that is also at the scale that is needed. We need to deal with an acute crisis that is rapidly escalating in terms of inflationary pressures, potential debt defaults, and hundreds of millions of people literally being priced out of their food from one day to another.
You've talked about this imbalance in recovery, that obviously these issues will affect the whole world, but it will affect some countries more than others.
Well, in some ways it is almost ironic that after having had a pandemic that literally hit the world as a whole, we are now facing another crisis that is affecting everyone. You can go into a supermarket in New York, in Tokyo, or somewhere on the continent of Africa, or perhaps here in Jakarta. Everybody can see what the impact of this cost of living crisis is having on everyday ability to consume. But obviously the wealthier you are, the more reserves you have, the better you can cope with these shocks. And I think most concerning fact is that the UN Secretary General estimated that in 95 countries right now, roughly 1.6 billion people are directly affected by one of these 3 shocks, and about 1.2 billion people by all 3 of them hitting them at once. These are numbers that should be of grave concern to us, not only from a perspective of how do we avoid these crises, essentially making people give up hope and give up hope in the institutions. Hungry people cannot be patient. They move from institutions and political processes onto the streets. That is the scenario we are facing right now against a macroeconomic deterioration at the same time.
Achim Steiner, the Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme, thank you so much for those insights. We have heard over the course of these meetings that food security has really been raised as the top priority, and from what we heard just a short while ago from the Indonesian Finance Minister, there are calls to support that urgent need to address these food security concerns, and those concerns have been supported by some G20 members, but we don't have further information on that at this stage.
Thank you for that, Jessica Washington, there for us at the summit, G20 summit in Bali.